So that's wonderful. So thank you for this kind of overview. I think it would be great to spend a little bit of time now talking about the actual kind of work that JPAL South Asia does. And one of the things that we are doing in this series is to think about, you know, the shifting landscape due to COVID-19 and the kind of ensuing effects of the pandemic on the economy in terms of work, in terms of particular disadvantaged groups like women and minorities, and how their economic opportunities and work opportunities are changing. And JPAL has obviously done a lot of work in this area. And so, just as a kind of primer to get into this, JPAL recently started a sort of a gender and economic agency initiative. Tell us more about that and some of the work that it does. And then I'd love to hear, as a follow-up, how that work has been shaped by the pandemic.
Sure. So yeah, I think for JPAL, the Gender and Economic Agency is essentially an initiative that really aims to build a strong body of evidence on policies and programs to promote women's work and enhance women's economic agency. And there are sort of two geographies that it particularly tries to target, which are East Africa and South Asia. So I think one thing that I definitely want to say that a lot of the motivation behind this initiative, which is sort of, in partnership with the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, is really this acknowledgement that there is such lack of evidence and data on really even trying to understand what are the actual barriers that may be driving a lot of these gender inequalities that we are seeing, right? So, I mean, like you obviously know, with India, the female labor force participation is so low. But what makes it really difficult is the fact that many countries at the same level of economic growth as India are doing much better. So we're definitely an outlier here. And then it's also declining, right? At the same time, if you look at some other countries, say in sub-Saharan Africa, we find that the female labor force participation is much higher, but then there is still a lot of disparity in productivity or in pays. So I think for us, this particular initiative is really started with the idea that we need better measurement. We need evidence on what works and what does not. But the first of having better measurement is extremely critical for us to also understand what the problems are in the first place. And because it's so context dependent, because economic empowerment for women can look so different depending on where they are, the challenges are even more. So the GR, like as we refer to it, basically has three main thematic areas on which it tries to focus. So the first is workplace arrangements and labor policies to promote formal and informal employment for women. The second is the idea of enhancing women's labor potential and work readiness. And I know that you have personally also done some work in this area with respect to sort of some types of trainings that we could provide. And finally, it is trying to address restrictive gender norms and attitudes related to women's work. So again, these may look kind of broader thematic areas, but the overall point is that because the structural barriers to women's participation could be so many, and we don't know which of these levers we need to push forward, it's really important to have a sort of a systematic body of evidence that can help shed light on this. So that's where we are starting out with in GIA. And of course, the whole idea is for us also that there is a huge dependence on trying to work with NGOs, with firms who are actually really thinking about this innovation. So for us, our role is to really spread ourselves to understand what's happening out there, and then bring in our research to collaborate, researchers to collaborate. And also, of course, first is to like really try to push the field in terms of the measurement aspects as well, which as you know, are really a question. And I think this measurement part, I really want to talk a little bit more because it's something that's really close to my heart, is that not only if we don't get how we measure women's economic empowerment right, not only do we run the risk of not understanding the barriers and the constraints, we also may think certain programs don't work because our measures are faulty. So they're not picking up the variation. and that to me is the more scary part, right? So I feel like that's where I think the field really needs to go. And then of course there are all of these different thematic areas which are really important.
So I absolutely agree with that. With regard to measurement, I think it's amazing that we're speaking through this initiative to Professor Ashwini Deshpande, and she's done some work in this area as well. Um, the fact that we actually don't even know how grave the problem is to a certain extent, right? Because certain things about the way that we measure labor force participation, tweaking them in very small ways ends
Yeah,
up really,
absolutely.
generating huge impacts on the rate of labor force participation that's measured. So, um, I think there's a lot to dive into there, but you're absolutely right that measurement has to be key to all this, because if we don't understand what these rates are and why we find differences when we measure things, one way versus the
Yeah.
other, then we're not going to be able to devise policy solutions around that.